Buonasera a tutti, ho l'onore e il piacere di presentare Jason Byron, firma storica sia per i Maudlin Of The Well che per i Kayo Dot di tutti i testi, nonché brillante autore di libri di cui avremo modo di parlare questa sera, in particolare di Blasphemy, che è il personaggio, oltre che il libro, al centro di un concept appunto dei Kayo Dot. E quindi, senza ulteriori indugi, uno scrosciante applauso per il qui presente Jason Byron.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out to see me. My name is Jason Byron. I'm a longtime collaborator with Toby Driver and friend. I've been collaborating with him for over 20 years. Maudlin Of The Well, I've written probably approximately 75% of their lyrics, and as far as Kayo Dot, probably closer to 93 or 94% of their lyrics. I'm the only member of Kayo Dot who no one has ever seen. Anyone who knows me will tell you that I love Tangerine Dream. I am not a huge krautrock fan specifically, though I am a fan of electronic music in general. And I also love the scores and soundtracks to various films, television shows, and video games spanning the last few decades. Before I knew anything about Edgar Froese, or Klaus Schulze, or Chris Frank, or Peter Baumann, I knew Ridley Scott's 1985 film, Legend. It is one of the few movies that I love just as much today as I did when I first saw it as a boy. If you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend checking it out. It is one of Tom Cruise's first movies, well before he lost his mind, and Mia Sara as Dark Lily may have been what initially attracted me, along with thousands of other boys my age, to the goth look. Now, there are two versions of this film, a European and an American. The American version is more heavily edited and was scored by Tangerine Dream. The European version is much longer, with added scenes and dialogue, and featuring a score by Jerry Goldsmith. This latter version I consider terrible for all the reasons it is supposed to be good. The added scenes showcase poorly written dialogue that should have been left out, and the score is too soaring, saccharine, and far too distracting from the actual story. Basically, if you haven't seen it, watch the American version. Anyway, I did not know at the time that Tangerine Dream had made a name for themselves in the 1980s by scoring films. I had not yet seen Sorcerer, or Risky Business, or Thief, or The Keep. But upon my 100th viewing of Legend when I was 16, I started to pay particular attention to the soundtrack, as I had already memorized the entire screenplay. I noticed the name Tangerine Dream in the credits and decided that I needed to have a copy of this soundtrack. Now, do not get this need confused with expanding my horizons or exploring music or doing anything that could be considered even remotely healthy. I'm an escapist at heart, and my reasoning at the time was that if I could listen to the soundtrack to one of my favorite movies, I could more easily pretend that I lived in an enchanted forest in a magical cottage surrounded by elves and fairies and goblins and unicorns. One winter evening, Greg Massey came over. Greg was the first one of us to get his driver's license, so, unfortunately for him, he became our designated driver for some time. I asked him if he would take me to Coconuts, which was a record store closer to where he lived than where I was. Greg did like to explore music, so he was more than happy to oblige. And I did end up finding a cassette of the soundtrack, which I bought, and which I ended up being a little disappointed with because only half of the score was there. The Jack and Lily theme was my favorite piece, for example, and was nowhere to be found. In fact, as an aside, I ended up discovering this lost track on YouTube during the winter of 2013, and I listened to it more or less non-stop while writing the words that would become Kayo Dot's Bardo. By the following summer, I had listened to the Legend soundtrack pretty much to death, but had developed a genuine interest in the artist. I began to explore Tangerine Dream's catalog, unaware of how vast it was. Every time I visited a record store, I would find something different to buy. Some of it was brilliant, some of it was alright, and some of it was unlistenable garbage. That's what's going to happen when you've got over 50 studio albums, countless live albums, soundtracks, remixes, and remixes of remixes under your belt. I've seen their catalog separated by era, by member, by label, and by color. In 1996, Tangerine Dream released a studio album called Goblin's Club, which was both mediocre at best and instrumental in what would eventually become my first novel, Blasphemy. I bought Goblin's Club one Sunday morning in a mall record store in my home state, not expecting much. I listened to it and dismissed most of it, not disappointed. I never thought it was a good idea to bring saxophone into Tangerine Dream, and I do stand by that assertion. It just doesn't seem to work. Anyway, I did not dismiss one of the songs on Goblin's Club, which was called Rising Hall in Silence. There's nothing particularly special about it, other than the awesome title and the fact that I found it could be divided into 3 distinct parts. It is not a particularly lengthy song, just under 8 minutes, but with repeated listens, mostly while driving the 45 miles or so back and forth from my girlfriend's college, I found myself beginning to develop the framework to a story that coincided with the 3 parts of the song, or at least how I divided it and what images they conjured. Now, people have asked me how I write Kayo Dot lyrics, and the answer is that there is no specific way. Toby has both sent me rough mixes to listen to and left me completely to my own devices, as with Ubardo. He's given me specific instructions regarding both meter and theme, and has had me change the number of lines, the stresses, the meter, the accents, and individual words. And he has changed the music to fit the meter of the line or the length of the verse if it didn't fit the way that it should. It's an organic and entirely natural process that works toward the common goal of writing a cool song. The way that I write, regardless of components, boundaries, meter, or whatever, is by intuition. I write what I see and what I feel, and these are especially affected by the music that I'm listening to. Songs, pieces of music, will evoke feelings and present images, not unlike those seen and felt while scrying into a crystal ball or a black mirror or a tatva or a tarot card. People like to dismiss these as reveries and flights of fancy and just your imagination, but they are what they are. They're visions, and visions could be translated into poetry and song lyrics by anyone who cares enough. Now, the 3 parts in Rising Hall in Silence evoked images in my mind, and every time it came on in my car, I thought about it. The first part consisted of a plan to go out on a sea of clouds in an airship in search of treasure. The second part consisted of the adventure on the clouds, and the third part was hauling up what was on the bottom of the clouds, whatever that might be. Other than sketching out a scene or 2 of a theoretical play in my early 20s, I never got around to developing it in any serious way. At one point, I played with the idea of making it an allegorical story. I considered making 3 characters on the airship conflicting parts of the human soul, and the sea of clouds the mind. The treasure, when it would be found, would be spiritual illumination, which would have resolved all conflicts between the parts of the mind and the soul. Regardless, I left the idea to revolve in the back of the sea of clouds, which is my own mind, and moved on to other things. A few years later, I came up with the concept of Ubardo. I had been reading Rosicrucian and Hermetic literature at the time, such as The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz. I drew inspiration from this strange story and ventured to compose my own. I had tried something similar when I was 19 or 20, after I had read some of William Blake's longer and more mystical poems, The Visions of the Daughters of Albion, mainly, and ended up with a piece of writing I called 6 Trillion Miles Before the First, which fans of Maudlin Of The Well will recognize. Thankfully, they will only recognize 2 excerpts from this embarrassingly atrocious attempt. A fan had asked me a couple of years ago if he could read the entire piece, and I politely refused. It did push the concept back to the front of my mind, though, and I've outlined it, and it very well may be a project in the future. So I sketched out and wrote the first few sections of a mystical piece of writing, which was not called Ubardo at the time. The meteor was there, the lightning rod, and the sea. The poet I referred to as a woodsman. I got as far as the protagonist planting the seed, and that was approximately where I ran out of steam. The alchemical potential was all there. I only got stuck when I couldn't figure out what exactly would grow from the mysterious seed. When Toby approached me to write a concept album, maybe 10 years later, The idea of the mystical meteor came back, and I decided that it was time to bring it to fruition. I divided what would become the story into 11 poems, because 11 is the sum of points in the pentagram and the hexagram, which signifies adeptship or spiritual maturity. The story begins on a new moon and follows its course, ending on the full moon, and it's loosely based on Shelley's long poem, Alastor, or The Spirit of Solitude, which is my favorite Shelley poem. After I decided that when the seed was planted, it would grow into a river and usher the protagonist away to his death, I knew that this surreal story was now brought fully to consciousness and developed. And by the end, it was finished. It was out of my head and had been manifested. I was completely satisfied. In 2017, after Coffins on Io and Phobos, when my own personal life was at its lowest point in recent memory, Toby and I began to work on a second concept album. I didn't have the energy to come up with a new idea for the story, so I decided to develop one that had been rattling around in my head since I was 19. The Adventure on the Sea of Clouds, for whatever the fuck they haul out. With the deadline looming, I forced myself to work and develop the story once and for all. I don't remember exactly where the idea of the girl came from, but naming her Blasphemy was an idea I had a couple of years prior. Wouldn't that be a cool name for a girl? Blasphemy. I decided on 3 antagonists working against each other, and thus being unable to survive the shared threat when it arises. Toby wanted something shorter in overall length, so I chose 8 poems for this endeavor. Not so much for any Kabbalistic correspondence, as for the fact that 8 is the number of songs on both Master of Puppets and Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. The works of Blasphemy were completed by the end of 2017, except for some minor adjustments the following spring. I tried to tick that box the same way I ticked off my Meteor story, as a project which had been started many years ago and is now finished. I had found that I could not. My life was on an upswing by this point, as per the Hermetic law of rhythm, but I still felt something gnawing at me. I had just finished reading Stephen King's It, and was halfway through the Tommyknockers, and was beginning to ask myself whether I could produce a novel. Stephen King sure makes it look easy. I had also recently turned 40, so for some biological reason, I felt strongly that the time had come for me to start taking my writing more seriously. I had always wanted to write a novel, but shied away from the prospect due to a self-imposed short attention span. But, as I said, turning 40 does something to you, or at least turning 40 did something to me. I was happy with the 8 poems that comprised Blasphemy, but I did not feel the same sense of completion that I felt when Hubardo was written. There was just no way I could condense the story, which had been percolating in the back of my mind for almost 20 years, into 8 short poems. I gave myself a 300 words per day minimum, a modest and easily attainable goal that I surpassed most evenings, and finished my first draft of Blasphemy, a novel, in just under 1 year at over 200,000 words. My companion through the writing process was now the 7 books of Stephen King's Dark Tower series, the influence of which can be traced throughout. Blasphemy, as a result, has a gritty edge to it, to put it mildly, is both super violent and descriptive in its violence, and showcases human beings at their absolute worst. It's humorous in places, terrifying in others. King is where I got the idea of starting many separate threads and tying them all together midway through. The Dark Tower is also what inspired me to tie the various stories and themes throughout the Kayo Dot and Maudlin Of The Well catalogs and create a universe. And this universe is where I will now live for the remainder of my creative life, creating threads, tying them together, and cross-referencing songs and literary works until I decide that I want to stop writing, or until I die. I would like to conclude by reading a short passage from the 14th chapter of Blasphemy, which is titled The Rising Hall in Silence. I played an encore with Kayo Dot yesterday, so I'm sorry that my voice is destroyed. Okay. The handle at first appeared to be a single ring of metal, but upon the removal of the hook, it was revealed that it was indeed 2. The bottom ring slid neatly in beneath the upper in a concealed groove, and these 2 pulled apart to open the doors. It was not very practical unless one considered its other use as an eye for a hook lowered from the obscurity of clouds. No one made a move to grasp the handles once they were free of the hook. They stood in dumb wonder, all four, and looked down at the closed cabinet and its covering of hieroglyphics. Tefeo thought he could make out a cock. Yes, definitely a cock and two balls. Another wind whipped across the deck of the Amalia and whistled over the open hole. The good captain finally broke the silence. "Well, antique dealer," he said. The sudden sound of his voice and the otherwise quiet as the grave space made them all jump. "It's your find." He gestured toward the cabinet. "Show us what we came out here for." Simon swallowed and licked his chapped lips. Then he smiled. The smile widened into a grin, his lips pulling back monstrously over his teeth. He looked like a ghoul, with his blazing eyes and his scraggly hair and his emaciated frame. Harp wondered if perhaps the skin hauler was afraid of something after all. It was out of character for him to pass on a chance to be the first at anything, and he always just took what he wanted. He was a real take charge, go get him type of person. Osmar Tefeo probably would have made a very good court rat if he had been dealt a different hand in life, the pilot observed. A twisted chief on some barony on Tajif. God knew he had the temperament and ethical standards for politics. Harp wondered why he thought these things and why Tajif seemed to pop into his head. The gaunt antiquarian moved closer to the cabinet and bent over the closed doors. His shadow fell heavily upon them and obscured the writing. He reached down, noticing his skeleton hands, and grabbed hold of the rings. They were warm to the touch, which Simon found surprising. He had assumed they would be ice cold. It was cold enough that plumes rose from the mouths of each of them. Salim exhaled deeply from where he stood, furthest from the thing and closest to the stairs, and watched his own breath smoke out of his mouth and disappear. He thought again of his dream, cold on the deck of the tiny airship and the warmth of its mirrored cauldron, and shuddered, not altogether from the cold. He watched through eyes round and wide, his lantern gripped tightly, oh so tightly in sweaty, trembling hands, as Simon Sorosamon reached down and took hold of the rings on the doors. His fingers were long and creeping, and they wrapped themselves tightly around them, and they pulled the rings apart, and they pulled open the doors to the cabinet with neither groan nor protest from the prehistoric hinges. The doors swung open with a click, and Salim could not see what was inside because of where he stood. But he saw Simon's back, and he saw him straighten, and he saw him take 1, 2, 3 steps back, and he saw him exchange looks with both Tefeo and Harp. Harp, who stood across from Simon, had removed his glasses, looking shocked. But Tefeo let out a snort and shook his head. "A cunt," he said matter-of-factly, and chuckled. He turned, shaking his head, and walked past Salim toward the stairs. The good captain looked at the companion as he walked by, smirking. "A cunt," he repeated, and hooted laughter. He walked heavily up the steps and left them.
So a lot of stuff to discuss. First of all, Jason, you are a lyricist, you are a musician, and you are a writer. So how do all these, let's say, dimensions of yourself coexist in your art?
One flows into the other. They're all basically the same. I've always wanted to write a novel, but as I said, I was intimidated by the idea of doing it. I didn't think I could. I don't think I had the discipline. So I stuck to poetry. Poetry is not easy, but it's easier and it's less intimidating because a poem could take 2 or 3 days and it's this or this or this, whereas a novel is this. I like to think of them as the same. I like to take poetic language and translate it into song lyrics and into prose. So the style of my writing, as far as my novels go, it does have a lyrical flow to it, and I do like to conjure up images with words. That's probably one of the things that one of the threads that runs through all of my writing, and one of the things that makes my writing definable and I guess observable, is that I like to use words to evoke feelings.
Okay, let's go deeper into Blasphemy in the novel. Frankly speaking, I recently had a look at the video clip of one of the tracks of Blasphemy, a sort of pixel art video clip made by Toby, if I'm right, where you see the three major characters together with Blasphemy. Can you go a bit deeper into the relationship between the concept of the album and the book itself?
The name of that song is Turbine, Hook and Haul, which is, I borrowed the name of that, well, it's a little bit of, I changed it a little bit, but it's basically Rising Hall in Silence, which is where my initial inspiration came from for Blasphemy, right? Pulling something up onto an airship. The style of that video, I thought was really, really cool and really well done. If you haven't seen it, check that out. Me and Toby discussed making it look like a Final Fantasy game. So it looks like the original Final Fantasy game. Fans of Maudlin Of The Well and Kayo Dot, who do know me at all or see my work, will see that I have Final Fantasy 1 has a profound influence on me, and it always has, just like Atari and just like the original Nintendo. It inspires me, and it inspired that video because it looks like the video game, and it's kind of supposed to do that. And it basically shows, it's not the climax of the book, but it's one of the cliffhanging areas or chapters of Blasphemy. It's a big part of the album, which is just a condensed version of the novel, which is just an extremely elaborate version of the album.
Okay, there are a lot of words in your introduction that need, let's say, some clarification. One of these is visions, from my point of view. So, what do you think when you talk about visions?
When you close your eyes, you see things. You can close your eyes and think, an apple, and when you close your eyes, you can see the apple. That's basically what an astral image is. You can conjure up whatever you want with your mind. When you listen to music, other people are everybody is capable of seeing visions or accepting visions. It happens naturally to everybody. But like I said, people are taught to ignore them, and it's like stop using. You have an overactive imagination when it's really one of the most important aspects of the human mind. Something that you can definitely develop and use, especially in the creative process in creating art. When I listen to music, especially instrumental, electronica, Tangerine Dream, that sort of thing, if I listen to it for a while, whether I'm just sitting there or if I'm like on a treadmill or if I'm doing anything, I start to see things. I'll start to imagine things. It gets my creative juices flowing, and I start to, not necessarily see things the way I see you or you see me, but I feel things. I get vibes. And anything that I can project into words, anything that I can translate into words, I would consider a vision.
By the way, you use another word which I think connects to visions, which is intuition. That's another word that you use frequently in your introduction. What is intuition for you?
Intuition is something that I've been trying to develop my entire life, and I'm now at the point in my life where I'm actually I'm open enough that I'm being receptive to it. Intuition is when you get a bad feeling or a good feeling about something and you listen to it. It's your inner self. It's you. But just like your imagination, just like your overactive imagination, most people are taught to just, or not even taught, but just instinctively ignore that little voice. The more you try to listen to it, the more it says to you, and the more attention you pay to it, the wider the door opens between the conscious and the subconscious, so that you can more easily get receive messages that you can use. I write by intuition. If Toby sends me something, a piece of a song, like a fragment. Sometimes it's a rough mix of just a guitar, sometimes it's guitar, drums, synth, any combo of that. I'll listen to it 1,000 times, and eventually I'll start, like my intuition will kick in, and I'll start feeling things, and I go with that. It's something that I've learned to do with my writing. I've written poems where I don't really know the meaning of some of the words that I use. It just comes out, and I'll look it up later and be like, oh, that's what that word means, and it just happens to fit perfectly. I don't know how that happens. I don't think I'm that smart. I don't. So it's interesting and it's a little scary, but it's pretty cool. On Choirs of the Eye, for example, there's a song called "A Picture of Summer," which a lot of people really like. And I'm particularly proud of that one because it's a cool idea. It's a surreal song, and it only took me about 5 minutes to write. I was in the middle of doing laundry, and I was going downstairs to do my laundry, and I came up with the idea, and I went upstairs and I wrote the entire thing down in 5, maybe 10 minutes. I might have went back and changed a word or two here or there, but intuition is just letting it go, letting it flow right out of you. And it works a lot. I've found that the more effort you put in to something, especially something like song lyrics that you're primarily supposed to feel, as opposed to like telling a story, the more you think about it, the more rigid of a feel it ends up having. The more, not false, but the more forced it sounds. I can't only write by intuition. Sometimes I need to work at something and rip it apart and play with it and change words and change syllables and that sort of thing. But sometimes it's just like the planets all line up and it just comes right out.
And that's a good point. Let's go a bit deeper into the creative process. According to your introduction, it looks like you almost force yourself to write because you put yourself a rule of 300 words per day.
Yes.
to write. But is it always like this, or maybe you have other habits in creating something? What are the possible scenarios apart from the laundry? Okay.
Apart from the laundry, yeah, apart from doing daily chores, when I write poetry, that's the kind of thing I sit down. It's not really that disciplined. I sit with it. I listen to a piece of music 1,000 times until things come out. I go and I change it. I play with it. But poetry is something that's supposed to, or song lyrics. I use the two. There's the two terms interchangeably because I've always considered them pretty much the same thing. But I write poetry when I'm inspired.